Well, hello. Have you all ever had something you really didn't want to do, but you felt like you had to because a friend asked you? That's how I got suckered into working with this orphan empowerment program. I knew that this was one of the cruelest humanitarian crises of our age. Over 100 million orphans living and dying in extreme poverty, suffering from disease and starvation and trafficking, abuses that break the imagination. Everything bad you hear about happening to children happens to these children. But my friend asked me, and so I came on ZOE's Orphan Empowerment Board. I was a little skeptical at first because I've been working in the doing good for humanity sector for about 20 years. And whenever something sounded too good to be true, it always was. So when my friend told me she had found this organization working with the most vulnerable children on the planet and moving these children from life-threatening poverty to sustainable self-sufficiency across every area of life with an 85% rate of success in just 3 years, I distinctly remember thinking, wow, that's really unlikely. But because my friend asked me, I came on ZOE's Orphan Empowerment Board, and then I learned more about the work and more about the results. And I was sold. I believe ZOE's approach has the power to change the world for 100 million orphans. It's not just about what ZOE is accomplishing, although that's better than anything I'd ever seen or even imagined. It's the way they're accomplishing it. By living into a paradox of working with the most vulnerable children in the world who are at the same time some of the most talented, some of the strongest children in the world. ZOE discovered a way to do less for these orphans so that they had room to do more for themselves. Now, this orphan empowerment model didn't just fall from the sky. It was born from the experience of those who had suffered, reaching out to those who are suffering. ZOE first began as just a regular relief outreach to African orphans, doing all the traditional charity things. But after several years, they had some extra funding to invest. And so they put out word that they were looking for something truly effective in working with orphans. And they were introduced to Epiphany Mujuamana. Epiphany and a team of Rwandan social workers had developed this radically different approach to engaging orphans in their area. After the 1994 genocide in her country, Epiphany, who had grown up as a vulnerable child herself, dedicated her life to helping the thousands of orphans. So she went to work where the resources were for some large Western aid organizations. You'd recognize the names. And she worked for each for several years, but became disillusioned with the work. And this is what she said. She said, I would watch as these generous people would come to my country, and they would give things to my people that my people desperately needed. And then I watched as my people became so good at receiving that they forgot how to do anything. And when the grant dried up or the focus shifted, these children in whom I'd invested my life were now worse off than before because they had become dependent upon this outside aid. So frustrated by this cycle of relief and dependency on a shoestring budget, Epiphany and her Rwandan colleagues developed a 3-year community-based empowerment program, helping these young people to permanently move beyond charity. So do you want to know how it works? Let me warn you, it's a little different. For example, with tens of thousands of orphans and vulnerable children currently enrolled in ZOE's program, there are no orphanages. ZOE doesn't own a building anywhere in the world. And ZOE doesn't give these orphans food, even though they're hungry, because ZOE's goal is to help them to get their own food. And this is a big one, there is roughly 1 staff working directly with the children per 1,000 orphans. That's not a budget limitation, that's the sweet spot where this program works best. Now, all that might sound a little strange, but it's about that paradox. These young people must take the lead in their own journey out of poverty. They must feel like they've accomplished it with some support from behind. ZOE's discipline not to do anything for these young people that they could otherwise do for themselves creates a space for them to work hard and succeed within a supportive structure, but still by their own initiative. Now, one important factor is that all ZOE staff are from the country where they serve, like Jabez here in India. The very first action of ZOE's Indigenous staff, even before they meet with any orphans, is to go and speak with the community leaders. ZOE will not even enter a village without support from the local leadership, so much so that the invitation to the first ZOE meeting doesn't come from ZOE, but from the village chief. And at that first meeting, ZOE's staff begin working to redefine expectations. These young people, these orphans, they expect to be given food. They, quite understandably, expect to be given aid. Instead, they hear about hope and the possibility that tomorrow could be better than today. They hear testimonials from ZOE participants further along in the program, and then they're encouraged to share their own stories with one another. One of the most debilitating aspects of extreme poverty is that even with so many orphans, these children often feel completely isolated. They may be sick, dirty, begging. They may steal food in order to feed their siblings and keep them alive. Neighbors begin avoiding them, and the orphans themselves start self-segregating themselves from other people. So to hear their story of suffering coming from the lips of another child lets them know that in this place, in this group, they're understood and are not alone. So those willing to give all this a try are gathered together into empowerment groups of 60 to 100 orphans and vulnerable children. Inside that 60 to 100 number, there's 20 to 30 child-headed households. For example, a 15-year-old girl with a 12-year-old brother and an 8-year-old sister would be such a household. A household might be a single street child or a sibling group of 8. But each household is led by an eldest child who's at least 12 years of age on up to 20 years old. These empowerment groups are at the heart of ZOE's program. They don't live together, but they work side by side to pull themselves and each other permanently out of extreme poverty. They elect group leadership and nominate a volunteer adult mentor from their community who walks with them. Over the next 3 years, ZOE stands behind these groups of young people with access to the small trainings and resources they need to get what they need. So instead of giving them food, ZOE will help train them to grow their own food and to start businesses where they can buy their own food. Over the course of this time, what we find is that these children begin to understand how empowerment works and begin to take ownership of their own lives. Now, one critical element that Epiphany and her team understood in designing this program is that poverty is not a single issue. Simply providing education or microloans or clean water will not in most cases free these young people from poverty. Poverty is an octopus of issues. And if these orphans somehow fight free from one tentacle, another 3 are there to take its place. ZOE addresses at least 8 major areas of life in a roughly simultaneous and holistic way in the context of a loving, supportive community. And what are those 8 areas? Now, 8's a big number. Are you all going to hang in there with me? Yep. As I mentioned, these orphans are often starving, so they must become food secure where they can grow and buy their own food. Escaping exposure, they need safe, secure housing which they either rent or own. Combating the constant threat of death from disease. Hygiene is taught, so they're not getting sick in the first place, and access to health care provided for when they do fall ill. Ending the heinous abuses they suffer. Child rights are addressed so they know what their rights are and how to enforce them. And woe to the person who messes with a ZOE orphan after their group has been trained in their rights. It's like the wrath of God has descended upon them. Because so many of them have dropped out of school, formal education is offered, or access to vocational training if formal education is no longer realistic. So that no child has to beg or work as slaves again. ZOE extends micro grants in the first year, micro loans in the second and third year, which are actually paid back to their own group. Each household comes up with a business proposal, which they submit to their group for approval. They even cooperate on group projects while at the same time supporting each other's individual businesses. Now, in the first year, they start very simply, but by the second and third year, they're hardened capitalists with much more sophisticated entrepreneurial enterprises. so that no child ever has to feel invisible or less than human. ZOE also addresses what I like to technically call the squishy things. Things like hope, a sense of being a valued member of the community, feeling loved and accepted. These squishy things may actually be the most important. If you do not have hope that tomorrow can be better than today, why work for a better tomorrow? And finally, in addition to being physically and emotionally well, ZOE wants these orphans to also be spiritually whole. Because of their suffering, many feel that God does not exist, or if God does exist, that perhaps God hates them. So ZOE staff share with these orphans that they're not beyond the love of God. Now, ZOE treats all orphans exactly the same, regardless of their religious beliefs. But over the course of their 3 years in the program, they will see and hear the most loving and inviting foundations of Christianity. However, one of the most inspiring aspects for me in the program is how quick to generosity these young people are. One might think because of their suffering and what they've been through that they would be out for themselves. Instead, if a young person in their group is too traumatized from abuse or malnutrition to think clearly, the other group members will bring them on as a business partner, refusing to let each other fail. And as soon as their own situations begin to stabilize, they start adopting and employing additional orphans, passing along their trainings and sharing their resources. You can see the bonds of cooperation in that 5, 6, 7 years after graduation, these groups continue meeting and working together. But it's not the structure or even the economic efficiency of ZOE's program that's most impressive. It's what these incredible young people do with this program that makes it truly special. Allow me to introduce you to Claudine, one of the many orphans who've earned my admiration and captured my heart. I remember when I first met Claudine, it was in Rwanda as she shared her story with our group. Her father died first, followed several months later by her mother. Both passed from HIV/AIDS-related illnesses, although she would never say that because of the stigma of the disease. During their protracted illnesses, the mud hut in which they all lived collapsed from disrepair. So at the age of 5 years old, Claudine found herself both orphaned and homeless. And she had a 3-year-old sister and a 6-month-old baby to care for. One of our group gasped, "Claudine, how did you survive?" "It was difficult," she said. "I would wake up in the morning and I would strap the baby onto my back, and I would leave my middle sister wherever we had slept the night before, and I would go into the village and beg for food." For 10 years, Claudine lived like that. As she grew older, she would beg for work instead of food, but too many nights they slept hungry. At one particularly dark time, Claudine thought they would all die, and so she sent her middle sister off to find work as a house girl in a larger community. An occupation that carries its own dangers, but Claudine thought at least she might survive. At the age of 15 years old, a friend told Claudine about an orphan program coming to their village. At that point, someone in our group said, "Oh, Claudine, tell us about your first ZOE meeting," expecting her to gush about the experience. "Oh, it was a difficult day," Claudine said. "We hadn't eaten in 2 days, and I came to the meeting with my sack, expecting them to give us food. But they explained to us that ZOE was an empowerment program and didn't give food. But she stayed and she heard the staff talk about hope, and she heard orphans in their 2nd and 3rd year share their stories, and then she hung on every word as all were invited to share their own struggles. And Claudine realized that in this group she was among people who understood her suffering." Well, Claudine decided to give the program a try, and she took to it immediately. She learned about health and hygiene and her rights. She started a business selling used clothing with several of the girls from her group, and then started a second business making a sorghum drink, which I've sampled, and I think it must be an acquired taste. But it sells well in the market. And she was even able to re-enroll her youngest sister back in school, but Claudine set her sights even higher. She apprenticed for 6 months as a tailor and then started a successful dressmaking business. She was doing so well that she began helping other young people in her group who were struggling in their own businesses. And ZOE was able to help her find and reunite with her middle sister. Claudine began speaking in churches about God's power to redeem a life even as broken as hers. But then after several months more, her group became concerned about her. Claudine seemed to be regressing. She was hungry again and tired. So they alerted the ZOE program facilitator, who went and visited Claudine in her home and immediately spotted the problem. Claudine had adopted 6 additional orphans. The ZOE facilitator said, "Claudine, why have you done this? It is too much for you. You were just getting your own life back together." "I know," said Claudine. "I didn't mean to do it. It was an accident." I saw these young people wandering the streets, and their mother had died 4 months before, and I remembered what it was like to be where they were. And I thought, how can I speak in churches about God's power and turn my back on these young people? So I invited them to my home just to give them a meal, just to tell them that I loved them. And after we'd eaten and talked, they wouldn't leave. So I asked them if they wanted to live with me, and they said they did. So Claudine was tending sick children through the night because from sleeping outside, they had bug infestations and various maladies. And then during the day, she would sew and sleep between jobs. So the ZOE facilitator told her group what she had done, and her group met and decided to help build a house for Claudine. And when I returned 3 months later, Claudine had a new, larger home for her new extended family, and some of the orphans she had adopted were beginning businesses of their own and re-enrolling in school. You could once again see an upward trajectory for that family. This is what makes ZOE's program so powerful. It allows these young people the dignity of not only receiving help, but of passing that help along to others. With over 10,000 orphans and vulnerable children currently graduating every year from ZOE's program, these young people are moving from being a problem in their area to being young entrepreneurs and leaders, lifting the whole community with the work they do. We try to raise our own children so that someday they can care for themselves. Why should our work with other people's children be any different? I hope you'll allow yourselves to get suckered into doing less for orphans, because together with Claudine and millions of young people like her, we really can change the world.